This week on Just Solutions, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia has said he will not vote for the Build Back Better bill, a measure that includes $555 billion for climate projects and clean energy transition. Manchin has a history of opposing climate change legislation, and he continues to support the coal industry, a dominant force in his state. But many of his constituents are pushing back, saying West Virginia needs to transition away from coal. Our guest today is Angie Rosser, Executive Director of West Virginia Rivers Coalition, one of more than 24 West Virginian organisations holding rallies in the state, calling on Senator Manchin to support the Build Back Better bill. We'll discuss what's at stake for West Virginia and what it's like to be an environmental activist deep in coal country. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Angie, it's so great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us on Just Solutions. Well, what has been the reaction in West Virginia to Joe Manchin's announcement that he won't support the Build Back Better bill?
Well, I think there was general surprise, Maeve, because, last we had heard reported was that he was continuing to engage in good faith with negotiations with Senate leadership and with the White House. So for him to make that announcement on Sunday, really put us in a different gear in terms of thinking, well, what does this mean? Is he really walking away completely? But I think since the announcement, there's a general sentiment that come January, there will be more discussion about the Build Back Better package and deeper, I guess, exploration into certain policies, and in some ways gives us more time and a chance. Although we've been spending a lot of time on this, but it's been so important to really break down and explain what policies are in this package that will benefit West Virginians. It's a big package, as you know, and but there are clearly some important provisions in there that can help West Virginia's workers, help transform our economy into the future. So we're going to keep working on explaining those and hopefully engaging with Senator Manchin on further dialogue about his concerns and our concerns.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how West Virginia could benefit from the Build Back Better, because I think many people were surprised that this week the United Mine Workers of America actually issued a statement urging Senator Manchin to support the measure. So what is in there that would benefit if we just look at climate provisions or energy and a transition away from coal? What is in there for West Virginia?
Well, two of the things that the mine workers pointed out are really important. One was the extension of the Black Lung Trust Fund. We're seeing more and more black lung disease and even some very young coal miners. And for those who may not know, this is a disease that affects the lung from being exposed to the dust and silica dust and other things while you're in underground mines. And it's a deadly disease and it's very costly to treat. And by extension of that fund, what it provides for is the coal industry to keep paying into that fund so the burden doesn't shift to taxpayers to take care of these miners who are sick and deserve our care. And that is in Build Back Better, that extension of the Black Lung Trust Fund. Another provision they brought up is something around tax incentives for manufacturing. And interestingly, this was a bill that Senator Manchin was a lead sponsor of. He introduced a bill, it's referred to as the 48C, that's a section of our tax code, which would drive tax incentives that would drive investment in clean manufacturing in places that are experiencing high rates of decline in coal jobs and coal plant closures. So that was another piece that if Build Back Better, if that doesn't pass, we're going to miss out on that chance to really get the reinvestment that we need and that we deserve as we're seeing the continued loss of coal jobs in the state. There are some other things we've looked closely at in terms of water and climate that are especially important to West Virginia. There's investments in lead line replacements. It's recently come to light that one of our cities in the north central part of the state, Clarksburg, we've got children with lead levels showing up in their blood, and which has brought the realization of we need to do a lot of replacement of lead lines in Clarksburg and likely other parts of the state. We need a lot more investment in water infrastructure that Build Back Better carries. And, one of the things when I think of the intersection of water and climate is noting that West Virginia is exceptionally vulnerable to flooding impacts just by virtue of our terrain. And I'm an example right out my window here is the Elk River, and I'm surrounded by two steep hills where all of our roads and a lot of our homes and businesses and infrastructure are located along rivers and streams that are prone to flooding. And what we know is that if we do not take the action necessary to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, West Virginia will be top of the list for absorbing or trying to absorb the cost of increased precipitation that leads to increased flooding. So there's some pieces in Build Back Better that addresses updating flood maps and making flood insurance more affordable. That would be extremely important and helpful for people in West Virginia. And then there's, in terms of climate and transition, there is assistance for repurposing retired coal plants. I mean, we're facing the inevitable closure of several of the coal plants in West Virginia, which are important employers in our communities. So we need to really start thinking now and bringing in as much assistance as we can to plan for these closures and what will replace them, and to make sure that whatever replaces them is another source of good paying, high quality jobs. So those are a few examples. And I guess with Senator Manchin's role as chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, he has a lot of power and influence and is in a position of leadership to be a thought leader, a policy leader on energy transitions. And I know he is recognizing that the nation is in an energy transition and that this will impact West Virginia. However, his approach to these things is innovation, not elimination. So he is concerned about policies that would accelerate the elimination of fossil fuels, and is more interested in investing in technologies that would reduce emissions. But we're of the mind that those technologies are certainly important, but we really need to take a look at the scientific imperative before us to reduce emissions in a way that meets the targets to stay below that 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global warming, and to avoid those worst impacts of climate change that, as I said, communities like mine along these rivers and streams will pay the price if we don't act aggressively enough.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about attitude toward coal and what it means in a state like West Virginia that's often dubbed coal country, and not just politically. I mean, it's been widely reported Senator Manchin's ties to the coal industry, albeit he says his current investments are in a blind trust, but there are deep roots there, connected to that industry, as there are, throughout the state. But the fact that coal jobs have been on the wane there, I mean, they have been declining over the years, but there's still a very strong attachment, it seems, in terms of an identity or even a culture. And I've heard it dubbed before, there's a culture around coal. So talk about what just regular West Virginia's attitude towards coal is, and how that either complicates or creates barriers for folks like you who are trying to have these discussions about the climate crisis and the need to accelerate movement towards clean energy.
Yeah, those are great questions that I like being asked, because I think people who don't live in this state don't have an appreciation for how complicated it really is. Even, talking about climate change and acting on climate is perceived as an affront or an attack on our way of life. Coal has defined what this state is. We are very proud of our coal mining heritage. There's a lot of pride in that. The state and our coal miners have helped power this nation for over a century, have kept all of your lights on out there, and have paid the price and taken the risks. I mean, coal mining is a very dangerous job. And so coal miners and coal miner families, I mean, often coal mining jobs it's a generational phenomenon. I know some folks who have 4 or 5 generations of people involved in the coal mining. Everybody knows someone who has been in the coal mining industry. So it's really, part of the fabric and identity of who we are. We have a statue at our state capitol honoring the coal miner. We have I used to have a football game called the Friends of Coal Bowl. It's just been part of who we are. So I think what is difficult about addressing climate and in a place like West Virginia is that it really puts us in a place of an identity crisis. Well, if we're not going to be a coal mining state, what are we going to be? Will we still be an energy state? What will that look like? And, I think it's important to recognize that, these coal miners who have lost their job or are afraid about losing their job because of certain policies or investments, I mean, those are really valid concerns. And this is no fault of their own, that these jobs are on the decline. It's just that market forces and the need to reduce emissions and that commitment is driving the trend this way, and we can't be left behind. And I think that's something that Senator Manchin has really echoed loudly, and I appreciate so much, because he is in that place of leadership to make a difference, that as we navigate this energy transition, to make sure that West Virginian is not left and our workers are not left out.
You spoke earlier, Angie, about the very real impact of the climate crisis on the state of West Virginia, the impact of flooding, and the nature of the topography of the state that makes you more vulnerable to flooding. And of course, we're seeing more of this because of the climate crisis. But there's been huge environmental degradation, whether it's water or, mountaintop removal or, contamination. And so how do you have those conversations in a state like West Virginia, given everything that you've just said around, okay, we've had this industry very much part of our economics, but also our identity, but it's not all been good for us. I mean, I know that your organization did release a report, A Citizen's Guide to Climate Change, and I think that was adapted to speak to West Virginians. As I said, it's very different being an environmental activist talking about climate change in a state like West Virginia than it is in, say, a state like California. So, how do you approach those conversations? How do you talk about this to folks who are in West Virginia?
Very sensitively. I mean, the truth of the matter is, you're right. I mean, there's no denying that extraction and extractive industries had an impact on the landscape and have caused damage and degradation to our water. And it gets very personal when people's own drinking water has been contaminated. And there's hundreds, if not thousands, of stories of that. There was news just today, a news story about a community in southern West Virginia, McDowell County, who has been on a boil water advisory for 11 years straight and finally got some upgrades to their drinking water system. So, I think what's complicated is I think there's no denying about the damage and the sacrifice, the environmental sacrifice. It's just hard, to not point fingers, cast blame. And I think there's also this mentality of acceptance and there's this word we've come to know of sacrifice zones. So fossil fuel sacrifice zones, that there are trade-offs to be made, that because unfortunately, extractive industries have been really some of the best paying jobs available to people in the state. And the unfortunate is there's not real viable alternatives in many of our communities. So there is a sense that this is just a trade-off we have to make, that in order to have jobs and put food on the table, that maybe we're going to have to be on boil water advisories. But I think what's happening in the state, Maeve, that I think has us reaching a tipping point is we are first in the nation for population loss. We are losing a whole generation of West Virginians at a pretty staggering pace. We just lost a congressional seat after this last census. So I think what I'm seeing in those conversations in a way to approach them in terms of like a universal value, no matter what political party or who you voted for, people are interested in keeping their kids in West Virginia and having their kids see that there is a viable future here, not only for jobs, but also for quality of life and health. It's been interesting to try to push further on the intersections of climate, environment, extraction, and public health. We have some pretty stark, I guess, health factors that are not good, that need improved. And we know that if we can build a healthier environment, reduce pollution, that we can have a healthier population. And everyone I talk to wants that for their kids, wants that for the next generation.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching. Maybe you're in West Virginia. Maybe you're in a state that's similar to this, that has deep roots in the fossil fuel industry. So these conversations around the climate crisis and transition are very nuanced and sensitive. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. Well, Angie, what is it like to be an environmental activist? I mean, it sounds like you have to be very sensitive, but you're from West Virginia. You're not somebody who's flown in to tell people what to do. What can maybe other states learn around having these conversations with people who have very different relationships, say, to the fossil fuel industry, because this is playing out in multiple states that have ties to maybe fracking or natural gas or different things, that these conversations are playing out in different ways, or maybe need to play out in different ways to be sensitive to what's happening in a particular state. So what have you learned about being an environmental activist in West Virginia, talking about these things, that, some of the messaging that's effective?
Yeah, well, in addition to what I just said about kind of everyone wanting a better future for their kids and healthy communities, clean water, clean air, what I've noticed, and my suggestion to my colleagues, and we talk a lot about this in the environmental movement, is how we often do a good job of saying what we're against, and no, we don't want fracking, no, we don't want mountaintop removal, but understanding that there is an economic and jobs connection and correlation to this. So how do we challenge ourselves to really dig deeper into conversations about, well, what is it that we want? What is our vision? What is the counter vision for this state, for this region of Appalachia, that is not so dependent on fossil fuel and polluting industries? And if we can have those conversations in a way that reassures that good jobs and economic security must be part of those solutions, I think we can get somewhere. Now, that's really difficult because, when I drive around places in West Virginia, especially our coal mining communities, you don't see many other options. So even just imagining something different is a challenge. And I think, and on top of that, what I experience is a large distrust in government. And I understand why, because promises have been made to West Virginia, to Appalachia, that haven't been delivered upon. We still have some of the lowest median income, those low health indicators. Yet we have been rich in these natural resources that have been extracted from under our feet. Yet we remain some of the poorest communities and counties in the country. So, how do we absorb that and work together on a different vision is something that isn't going to happen in a matter of weeks or months. It's a longer conversation and a multi-generational conversation, and one that I hope, Maeve, that we can figure out how to transcend the politically divisive times and rhetoric that we're in. I mean, that's really, really challenging. It's a very partisan and divisive sort of situation we're finding ourselves in, especially with this budget reconciliation and Build Back Better. But when you start unpacking the specific policies and investments and benefits to West Virginia, aside from the partisan divide, and have the conversations on the substance and what communities self-identifies what they need, it's like kind of that has to come first. And that's something else I noticed. You're right about, Washington, D.C. or the East and West Coast coming in and telling West Virginia what it needs and how to spend this money. I think if we can flip that on its head, and I'm starting to see signs of that, where local communities, local leaders, local elected officials are involved in defining what communities need and making sure that they're a part of that decision-making process and implementation. And those are very, need to be locally defined and locally coordinated sort of solutions, if that makes sense.
Well, give us some examples maybe of some of those solutions. You said you're seeing it a little bit, but what would a just transition away from coal look like in West Virginia? Are there examples that could be looked to for inspiration that could be replicated in other parts of the state?
Yeah, well, one of the areas we're working mostly some on is, West Virginia is a stunningly beautiful state. Our scenic beauty, I would argue, is unmatched. And that's why I love to live here, our rivers and streams. And people are discovering that in new ways, I think, during the pandemic. And we're seeing communities really define how they can utilize our natural beauty and outdoor recreation resources in different ways. So even in the southern coal fields, we're looking at recreational river trails, rails to trails developed, new trout fisheries being developed. Really kind of marketing the state as in a different image than it has in the past, which it deserves as well. So that's one example. There's other conversations happening about, we've got a vast amount of formerly mined lands, and how to repurpose those, and what is the possibility of the feasibility of converting them into large-scale solar fields. And I know that that's something that Senator Manchin has been interested in investing in as well.
But we have Kay, who's watching on YouTube, who asks, why do you keep electing Manchin? And she's actually watching us in Northeast Ohio, which she says, has been ruined by fracking. A lot of people from outside of the state maybe ask similar questions. And I'd love your perception on that, particularly with the series of rallies that have been happening and are ongoing at Senator Manchin's West Virginian offices. I know there are many West Virginians who are showing up and voicing their displeasure. But what is the political landscape? What are some of the political alternatives? Are you seeing any of that happening in West Virginia, or is this, something that just the rest of the country doesn't understand what's going on there?
Well, there's a fascinating political history in West Virginia, Maeve, that would take another show to go into. But we were, largely a strong blue Democrat state. Democrats outnumbered Republicans 2-1, and that has swung drastically the other way. We are getting more and more red, more and more conservative, definitely more and more Republicans getting elected. Senator Manchin really is one of the last lead Democrats that continues to be able to win elections. We've definitely, and there are political pundits and analysis that folks could offer on why this has happened. But Senator Manchin has been a in politics in West Virginia for a long, long time. He is a well-known figure to us. I think at the end of the day, many folks still believe that he is cares about the people of West Virginia, and that's why he is in politics, in public service to do so. But the reality is that the state is strongly conservative, and that's when I go back to, as being an environmental activist, is where do we tap into the core values around good health, quality of life, future for our children, scenic beauty, protecting the natural resources we have, creating sustainable long-term jobs that don't rely on a boom and bust economy that we've seen in coal and now some in natural gas development as well. So, Senator Manchin had his closest election last time, and I think, he is responding in his the way he's navigating his analysis of these bills before him, in terms of what West Virginians are concerned about. I mean, well, I'm not an economist, so I won't go into the whole inflation thing, but inflation is a serious concern for folks who are living from paycheck to paycheck. Paying just a little more at the gas pump is not an easy thing to absorb. So, what I know from economists, are looking at this as a temporary phenomenon created by the pandemic. But I can appreciate what Senator Manchin is saying about making sure that our policies, investments help those most in need, because there are certainly a lot of people in need in this state, and living on hanging on a thin thread of just putting food on the table and getting their kids to childcare so that they can keep a job. And so things like childcare and pre-K and paid leave, are so important. And I guess I'll end with one more thought on kind of what it's like to be an environmental activist in West Virginia. Is we have to understand the intersectionality of injustice, I guess, to our folks and to our community, and work in broad coalitions of groups that are not only working on environmental health, but are working on children's health, children's poverty, all kinds of issues that really are very interconnected. And I think because we're a small state with I guess an organizing community where we all kind of know each other and know that none of us can do this alone, that we're in a powerful position, I think, to show the rest of the country that all of this has to work together if we're truly going to lift everyone up, lift people out of poverty, take care of their health, lower their prescription costs, address climate change, improve water quality, provide access to safe drinking water to all people, no matter where they live. All of these issues have to be addressed together. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of that in West Virginia. It's one of my favorite things about working here.
Well, Angie Rosser, who's the Executive Director of the West Virginia Rivers Coalition, we really appreciate you joining us on Free Speech TV today. Thank you.
Thanks for the conversation, Maeve. I enjoyed it.
And don't forget, Free Speech TV's Just Solutions is now available as a podcast. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe, listen to back episodes, and tune in every week for Free Speech TV's Just Solutions.